morning. You can be opening your Bibles to Matthew chapter 28. Matthew chapter 28 is going to be the text that we look at in this lesson. What we're going to look at in Matthew chapter 28 are recording probably the most important events in human history. We are accustomed to news being bad. You bring your car to a car shop place and it's going to cost more than you thought it was going to cost. The problems were worse than you thought. You go to a doctor because of some pain you've been feeling and it's worse than you thought it was going to be. You turn on the news and there's more things happening in the Middle East. There's more things to be worried about with the economy. When we hear the word news, at least for me, I hear the word news and I have this reflexive nervousness about what's going to come next. I mean, how many have you on social media have seen breaking news? A bunch of dogs were saved and they were going to die. It's always something bad. And the Bible teaches that Jesus has brought about the gospel, the good news. And because we use that phrase, good news, good news, good news, we almost think of it like it's its own term now, and we just insert, that's a system of beliefs that we believe about Jesus and all of that. Just flip the wording of it and just see if that changes the way you think about it. Jesus brought news that's good. That's what he came to bring, is news that's good news. News, by definition, is an event that's happened. And that event changes the landscape of everything that we say and do and believe. And it's in Matthew chapter 28 that Jesus rises from the dead. And as we read this, you'll see that the women who come to the tomb, the two Marys, as it's recorded here in Matthew, that come to the tomb, they're expecting to see the tomb. They're not expecting to know that Jesus rose from the dead. But can you imagine having all of your hope and faith in Jesus? And then an angel tells you that he's risen from the dead. This is the best news you could ever hear. And it's unlike the news that we typically hear. This is breaking news. The one that you followed has been raised from the dead. And it's supposed to change everything in the life of those original people. And if we understand what's being recorded here, we know that it's supposed to change everything in our life as well. Let's go ahead and read Matthew chapter 28. It's not a very long chapter, but Matthew chapter 28, starting in verse 1. Now after the Sabbath, toward the dawn of the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And behold, there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothing white as snow. And for fear of him, the guards trembled and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen, as he said. Come, see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead, and behold, he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him. See, I have told you." So they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me." While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, "Tell people, his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep. And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So they took the money and did as they were directed, and this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. When they saw him, they worshipped him, but some doubted. And Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age." I want to point out, as we look at this passage, we're just going to make some observations from this text, that this is all happening on the first day of the week. You can see that in verse 1. You know why in the United States we have a Saturday, Sunday weekend? It's because when the United States was being founded, there were some people that thought that we worship on Saturday, and then other people says that we worship on Sunday. And because there was this debate, they said, well, how about we just make it so they get Saturday and Sunday off? But it's in this text that we see this thing that we can see in lots of other places of the Bible. What kinds of things happened on the first day of the week, on Sunday? Well, right here we have the resurrection of Jesus, but going back to the very beginning of the Bible, the first day of creation would have been on a Sunday, because it was on the seventh day that he rested, making the first day of creation, let there be light. And you notice in this text, it was at the dawn of the day, like a new creation has begun. The first day of creation would have been on a Sunday, because on the seventh he rested, on the Sabbath. We have the resurrection here in this passage. Jesus rose from the dead on the first day of the week. 50 days later, or about that, in Acts chapter 2, you've got on the day of Pentecost, the tongues coming upon the apostles, and now the apostles are speaking in other languages, showing that Jesus' resurrection and this good news is supposed to be applied to everybody all over the world. That takes place on a Sunday. And then you have the Lord's Supper being taken on the first day of the week in Acts chapter 20, verse 7. And then you also have the collection being taken up in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, 1 through 4. And so you put all this together, and the first Christians started calling Sundays the Lord's Day. That this is the day of the Lord. This is the day that he resurrected. This is the day that we come together. And when you put all these passages together and you understand what some of the original first Christians, the things that they wrote, it stands to reason that this is the day that we come together and worship our God. And interestingly, 2 times in this passage, what is it that people are doing with Jesus? Jesus is being worshiped in verse 9, and he's being worshiped in verse 16. The women worship him. They're grabbing his feet. We'll say more about that in just a little bit. The disciples are worshiping him in verse 16, the apostles being the disciples there, and some of them are doubting. We'll say more about that in a little bit as well. But this is coming from the same Jesus who, do you remember when he was tempted in Matthew chapter 4? When Satan said, if you bow down to me, I'll give you everything. And then Jesus had responded in Matthew 4:10. Then Jesus said to him, "Begone, Satan, for it is written, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve." Notice that, by the way, that worship and serve are equated with each other there. But Jesus says the only one that you worship is God. And then at the end of this same gospel, he's receiving worship. What does Jesus believe about himself? By the way, you realize that the word worship, if you trace back where that word comes from, it's connected to the word worth, or for something to be worthy, worthship. To worship something means that you think it's worthy. What's one of the things that the resurrected Jesus instills in the women in verse 9 and instills in the apostles? He's risen from the dead, and he's worthy of worship. What do you do with the one that's risen from the dead? But realize that he's worth everything. He's worthy of everything. This chapter, if you were to ask yourself, what part of this chapter do we see a commission about going out and telling people about these things? Well, the Great Commission, as it's oftentimes called, starting around verse 16, is this famous passage where Jesus says, I want everybody to know about this. I want everybody to understand who I am. But do you realize that this whole chapter is made up of 3 commissions? In verses 1 through 10, there's the commission to the women that are going to the tomb. And they're told, go tell the apostles that he's risen from the dead. And then you've got this false commission with the Jewish leaders meeting with the Roman guards, if indeed they were Roman guards, saying, like, let's come up with this story about how Jesus' body was stolen. And then you've got the Great Commission. And so that's one way that you can outline and think about what's going on in this chapter. But I want us to try to imagine. Try to imagine for a moment that you were in this scene. Starting with the commission to the women. Imagine being one of these women who would have seen Jesus' death on the cross. You would have been grieving over what it is that you had seen. You had witnessed the crucifixion, and the other gospel accounts show us that there's other women that are with them. And as they get to the tomb, you can imagine them crying, and the Sabbath is over, so Jesus' body has rested on the Sabbath. And they're emotional, and they're struggling, and they come, and as they get closer and closer, there's this great earthquake. Imagine the ground shaking. When Samantha and I lived in San Diego, there was one time that we experienced an earthquake, and it happened at like 4 a.m. And in the whole apartment complex, everything just sounded like a bowling alley, bowling ball, where people would go bowling. And it shook the whole thing. Can you imagine walking to the tomb and everything shakes, and then you see this angel that looks like lightning, and this stone has been rolled away? I mean, how did they ever think that they were going to get into that thing? Those stones weighed about 2,000 pounds. There's these guards. You imagine these guards that I think were Roman guards, and they're looking at all of this happen. And does the earthquake roll away the stone, or is it the angel that did it? I'm not sure what the sequence on all of that would have been. But these guards fainted like they were dead. Have you ever seen videos of fainting goats? Like the goats that if you come up around a corner and go, rah, and then the goat and then it falls over, and it's like faints like that, like it's dead for a little bit. I imagine the guards kind of like trembling like this angel that looks like lightning. His clothes are very white, and the stone is rolled away. It's ironic that in this story that the ones who were assigned to guard the dead Jesus became as if they were dead. Well, the dead have now been made alive, if you caught all of that. Can you think about the women here, though? Here's the guards, and they're like these fainted goats on the side, and they're looking at this angel, and the angel says, he isn't here, he's risen, come see the place where he lay. Why do you think that the stone was rolled away? It seems like Jesus' resurrected body in the Gospel of Luke, that he can kind of like go through walls and stuff. Why roll away the stone? Was it so Jesus could exit? I think he could have just gone through the walls somehow, in a way that I don't understand. I think the stone was rolled away so that the women could go in and see, okay, this is where he was. And this tomb doesn't smell like a rotting corpse. Jesus has, in fact, been risen from the dead, as he said would happen. I think it's around 5 times before this in the Gospel of Matthew, where he kept telling the people that he's going to rise from the dead, he's going to rise from the dead, and he finally has, and these people who heard these things didn't understand all the implications of all of this, but the angels give them this commission. Go quickly, tell the disciples what you've seen, tell them to go to Galilee, and Jesus is going to meet them there. Can you imagine with fear and trembling and excitement, all the mixed emotions, as they rush to go find the disciples? And on the way, Jesus comes, and he just, I don't know, did he disappear out of nowhere? I don't know. Greetings. And the women just instinctively fall down and they grab his feet. Why would the text emphasize that they grabbed his feet? Jesus is not an apparition. He's not a ghost. If you can actually grab his feet, that means that he was literally bodily raised from the dead. Don't be afraid. Go to the disciples. Go to the apostles. And you can imagine them going. But then we pan over to this, I imagine, ominous, like dark room with like eerie candles. And the guards, who are no longer like fainted dead goats, like go meet with the Jewish leaders. And they say, we've got some really bad news. This angel kind of did this stuff and made this claim that Jesus is alive now. And Pilate was even worried that that Jesus' body would have been stolen. They were already anticipating this kind of thing because in Matthew chapter 27, verse 64, let's see if I can get this up here. Matthew 27:64, Pilate had ordered that the tomb to be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples go and steal him away and tell the people, he has risen from the dead, and the last fraud will be worse than the first. Pilate was already worried, okay, maybe the disciples are going to steal Jesus' body. We already had that thought in our mind, so let's just go ahead and roll with that story that the guards fell asleep, and that's when the body was taken, and we'll just spread that lie. This will be the false commission. And while they're doing all of that sort of thing, here's the apostles in Galilee where their training with Jesus started. It was in Galilee that Jesus had originally called them and said, come and follow me. And here they are, and they meet Jesus at this mountain, and it says that some of them believed and others of them doubted. Can you imagine, again, we're so used to bad news that to hear all of your hopes and dreams that have been crushed have actually been reversed. Well, this is too good to be true. And you see him and you go, for the last couple of days, I've been weeping and crying, and I don't know what to do, and I don't know how to process all of this. I take it that there's this process that they had to do where they started to understand that all of this was true. And Thomas doubted more than the others. And Jesus' last words in the Gospel of Matthew is, I have all authority. Can you imagine talking to somebody, and they're not lying? All authority is given to me. Okay, yes, sir. All right, this is what I want you to do. I want you to go into all the world and teach people what I've said, and I want you to baptize people in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and then there he goes. The most important event recorded in human history. And maybe like the apostles, we might look at this and go, well, is this really true? You can even find liberal scholars today that say that we don't need Jesus to have literally bodily raised from the dead because it's just kind of like a good inspirational story, and it doesn't require that he actually rose from the dead. No, that's not how we should look at this. Why do you believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Is it because grandma told you that he did? Or because the preacher said that he did? What are the evidences, even within this story, that Jesus actually rose from the dead? I want to draw your attention to verse 15. In verse 15 where it says, so they took the money and did as they were directed to do this false commission. And then notice where it says, and this story has been spread among the Jews to this day. Well, what does that mean, it's been spread to this day that Jesus' body was stolen? Is that saying even to our day right now? Well, no, because this was written like 2,000 years ago. This is saying that it was written shortly after the events took place. That at the time Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, this was still what the Jewish people were trying to circulate, that the body was stolen. You realize what this means then, is that Matthew's recording these events within the lifetime of the people that it happened in. What year is it? It's 2024, so 9/11 happened 23 years ago. A lot of us can still remember it, and you can remember a lot of the vivid details you have in your mind. 23 years after the fact, could you still give a pretty accurate understanding of what you remember that day? Probably. There's some of you that probably even remember the assassination of JFK, which was, 61 years ago, something like that. And even though it happened a long time ago, it's still been within your lifetime. Could you explain to people with a pretty good amount of detail how you remember the events of that day? Matthew is saying that these things were recorded in the lifetime of the people that it happened in. This wasn't written 300 years later, where you could make up things about it and nobody would be able to fact check you. So, what are some things that we see being written within the lifetime of these people that show that this really happened? Here's a couple of things just quickly. The women are the first witnesses. You realize that in this time period, women were not allowed in the court of law because, as Celsus, one of the first proponents against Christianity, you can read a book called The Fragments of Celsus, and he has all of his arguments against Christianity. And one of the things that he said about Mary being one of the first witnesses is that women were hysterical female deluded by sorcery. That was his perspective of women. So if you were going to make up a story, why would you have women being the first witnesses? Because in that day and age, nobody's going to take that as credible. But what if you were determined to write this down like it actually happened? This is how you would do it. Because people didn't trust in the testimony of women. And the women are kind of the apostles to the apostles, going to the apostles and letting them know Jesus has risen from the dead. They were the most loyal to Jesus in his death. They were the ones at his tomb. You have the women as the first witnesses. Why record it that way if that's not really how it happened? Another thing is in verse 17, the doubt of the disciples. I mean, that's kind of embarrassing. Can you imagine being Matthew, writing the Gospel of Matthew down, and you go, you know what? Maybe you imagine them in this room together, and they're going to try to make up this religion that's going to change the world. And all the apostles are like, hey, I got a great idea. Let's make it look like we didn't even believe it. You know, we didn't have like this macho-like confidence that these things actually happened, and that'll really convince people. No, that's embarrassing to say that. Why record that unless that's how it actually happened? But then another argument is the changed lives of the disciples. The disciples before the resurrection, in the Gospel of John, the Gospel of Luke shows some of this. They're scared, they're timid, but then after the resurrection, they're bold. They're willing to be persecuted. They're willing to be put in prison. Peter's willing to stand in front of the same council that before, when he was watching Jesus at that council, he's willing to tell them there's only one name in heaven, under heaven by which man can be saved, and that's Jesus. He says it to that council. How do you account for that? These things are being recorded within the lifetime of the people that would have known about these things. Do you know how many fact checkers there could have been that would have written things down saying that the Gospels were wrong about these things, but you don't have those kinds of ancient documents? You realize then that all of this shows us that Jesus actually rose from the dead. It really did happen. It's news that's good. Well, what's so good about this? What's the meaning of this for our life? I'd suggest, first of all, that if Jesus is risen from the dead, that means that he is the king. Which is what he says in verse 18, all authority has been given to me. But the book of Romans, which we're looking at on Sunday nights, Romans chapter 1, verse 4 says that Jesus was declared to be the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead, Jesus Christ our Lord. Jesus rose from the dead. What was it that the Jews wanted Jesus, the Messiah, to do in this time period? I want you to imagine for a moment that China took over the United States. And all over the United States now we have flags of China. And we have military outposts, like maybe former coffee shops you like to go to, that now the Chinese military is in charge of, and like there's soldiers out there stationed with their rifles and everything. And all around us, we're always reminded that we don't have our own country anymore. That's what it would have been like to be a Jew in this time period. The Romans had taken the Jews over. And there would have been military outposts, there would have been flags everywhere. It would have been constantly in front of their minds that they don't have the power that they wish they had. And what the Jews wanted Jesus to do was to remove Roman occupation. But do you know what Jesus did? Jesus put the whole world under Jesus' occupation. He did something far greater than what any physical deliverance could have accomplished. The Jews wanted Jesus to defeat the Romans, but instead what Jesus did is he defeated our biggest fears, and that's the fear of death. And he's put the whole world under his control. Do you notice how many times in this chapter people are being told, don't fear, don't fear, don't fear? The greatest enemy that we have are not Republicans, it's not Democrats, it's not China, it's not Russia. The biggest enemy that you have is death and sin. And Jesus, because of his resurrection, conquered what we are most frightened by. In the ancient world, you would have a king ruling over a territory, and Jesus now rules over the whole world. And you know what kings would do, like the emperor of the Roman Empire? Is he would set up regional governors. He would kind of choose the regional governors that I want. You know, I want Pilate, for example, over Jerusalem and that part of my empire. What is it that Jesus has done? He's the king, and who has he set up in charge all over the world as like regional governors? I think this is one of the ways that we can picture what it means to be a follower of Jesus and what this means for our life. That we are like in our workplace, in our family, in our schools, we are like the regional governors that are telling people, hey, this is what the king says, this is what the king expects of us, and we're not using earthly power and authority the way that a regional governor would. We don't even have political authority the way that we would think about that, but we are those who help enforce the laws of the king by laying our life down and helping other people know by the love that we have for them to make disciples of all people. Teaching everything that I've taught. Teaching people to observe. Now, he brings up this baptism thing. One of the last things he says before he ascends to heaven is baptizing them. Baptism is to reenact Jesus' death, his burial, and his resurrection. Jesus is saying you need to go out into all the world and help people know that because of their sin, they're spiritually dead. They need to acknowledge that and then be buried in water and rise to walk in a transformed way of living. Imitate my death, burial, and resurrection. Make disciples. This is the mission that Jesus gave us. These are the last things he said before he ascended in the Gospel of Matthew. Does that sound like a daunting task? Who do you know that you can read the Bible with? Who do you know that you can be praying for? The Gospel of Matthew begins and ends with God being with us. Do you see in verse 20, I am with you to the end of the age? And then the Gospel of Matthew begins when it talks about his conception. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel, which means God with us. Matthew chapter 1, God is with us. Matthew chapter 28, I am with you to the end of the age. This work that God has given us to do, he's going to be with us in it. He's going to help us in it. But ask yourself the question, if it's really true that Jesus rose from the dead, are you submitting to Jesus like he's the king? We have this glory battle. One of the hymns that we sang just a little bit ago, he is the potter, I am the clay. Do you look at yourself that way? Mold me and make me after thy will. All of us have this battle that we fight against God until we submit to him. Of, you know what? I'd like to do what I want to do. And I'm going to keep doing whatever it is I want to do until maybe some circumstance in my life wakes me up and makes me realize that he's the king, or I just humble myself and I see in the Bible that he knows more than I do. Have you reached this point in your life where you've said, you know what? It doesn't matter what Jesus says. If he knows better than me, I'm just going to go with what he says. I don't care what scholars say. I don't care what my best friends say. I don't care what my family says. If he's king and he rose from the dead, I want to just do whatever he says. And one of the things that he said to do is to make disciples of all people. What are you doing in those efforts? Notice, though, finally, the denial of the resurrection. In this story, in these events that are recorded for us, there's a few unbelievers. You've got the soldiers who in verse 12 were paid off for a sufficient sum of money. And then you also have the Jewish leaders. Why do you think the Jewish leaders didn't want to believe? This is a great opportunity for the soldiers and the Jewish leaders. I mean, the fainting goats, like if they could pick themselves up from that moment and go, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. Look at the opportunity. They have like a front stage, front, whatever it's called, pass. You know what I mean. Like, what is it called when you're front of something? What's it called? Front seat, thanks. Yeah, they have like a front seat view to the resurrection of Jesus. And they go, well, we'll be paid off for some money. We're not even going to go to the Jews and tell them, hey, we think you've been wrong about some of these things. The Jewish leaders, what is it that they're afraid of? Well, we don't like our position of power being taken away from us. We don't want to have to admit that we were wrong about these things. Do you see how insane it is that they refuse to believe? All throughout the Gospels, all throughout the book of Acts, there's basically two groups of people. People who hate Christianity and people who give everything to it. And when you look at the reasons people hate it, it's never because they saw a YouTube video that explained to them that all of it was a lie. It's not because they watched the History Channel and they learned that it was actually all aliens and Jesus is a made-up figure or something like that. The people that are unbelievers in the Bible always have emotional reasons for their unbelief. It's never because they're enlightened. It's because we don't want to lose our authority. It's because I don't want to have to be told what to do. It's because I don't want to have to lose the privileges that I have. And all the while, that murky way of thinking makes you miss out on the best news you could ever have. You notice in verse 10, when the women are being told to go to Jesus, in verse 10, they say, go to my brothers. Did you notice that in verse 10? All right, women, you first witnesses of the resurrected Jesus, go to my brothers. What's been accomplished in the resurrection? Jesus says, I'm your family. I'm your brother now. There's no amount of money, there's no amount of privileges or power in the world that's worth trading being a brother of Jesus for. But the people who deny it in this chapter have no good reason for it. Ask yourself this question. Are you giving everything you have to Jesus who put the whole world under his occupation? Or are you fighting against it? And then ask yourself the question, which view is more reasonable? We're about to sing this song, Almost Persuaded. If there's anybody here this morning that has been baptized at one point and began learning the things that God wanted you to learn, but you've been neglecting these things of late in your life, this is an opportunity to come back to the Lord. If you've not imitated Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, you've not been united with the best news in the world. If there's anybody that needs to do that today or talk to somebody about doing that, you can either come forward or before you leave, talk to somebody here. But the option remains right now. If anybody needs to come forward, you can do so while we stand and while we sing.